Hey, Chris,
Yes, sir.
can you hear me? Obviously you can hear me.
I got you, Peter. Yep, you're great.
Okay, thanks.
was just trying to hit it with that button. Yeah, it's a space, that's why I was hitting, but I hit it on this picture and it's the space bar, so, okay. All right, we're good. Sorry, you had a good day? Okay, get there that quick.
Okay, it looks like we have everybody here. It is 7:30. We'll now call the Bellefontaine City Council to order. Please rise for the invocation and the pledge led by Councilwoman Baker.
Heavenly Father, guide us this evening as we make our decisions that affect the neighbors and the larger community of Bellefontaine. We ask that you watch over our military and their families, as well as our first responders who have dedicated themselves to our protection. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Councilwoman Baker. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. DeSoma,
Here.
Mrs. James,
Here.
Mr. Kurtz, Mr. Kurtz, Mr. Lyle,
Here.
Mr. Reeser,
Here.
Mr. Springs, Mrs. Baker.
Here.
I have a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes.
I'll make a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes.
Moved by Mr. Springs, seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move on. But before we jump to administrative reports, we got a little bit of housekeeping I want to take care of at the front end here. We are currently in our first meeting in December. As you guys know, we have 2 meetings per month. I guess historically, we have not had a second meeting in December, but typically that's up to council. If we want to do that, we can. I think we have to have a motion and a second, but we need to understand that we have a number of items on the agenda tonight for first reading and for second reading that will all need to be moved tonight. We'll have to waive the 3 reading rule and adopt those on first and final or second and final. So if everybody's on board with that, I'll entertain a motion in a second. If not, and you guys want to have some discussion about it, we can have a little bit of discussion. Any comments from anybody? Okay, Mrs. Baker?
I was just going to say, Zeb, in finance, we talked about that possibility that we could go ahead and several of them we're going to have to move anyway, just because of the timing of them. So it wouldn't be too many for us for finance. And I don't know, Richard, do you want to add anything since you were also on that earlier Zoom meeting?
Yes, we talked about that as well. For Rules Committee, we have 1 ordinance up for adoption and 2 for first reading. Planning Commission has met on those, and I think that there would be no problem to do first and final for those as well.
Okay.
Unless somebody really wants to meet on December 20th, then
22nd. Yeah. So it sounds like we've got a number of things. The thrust of our agenda is finance, and the thrust of those finance ordinances are actually ordinances up for third reading. So it wouldn't be too much to get everything cleaned up. So if everybody's on board with that, I'll entertain a motion and a second, and we can to cancel the meeting on December 22nd. Mr. Springs?
I'll make a motion that we suspend the meeting on December 22nd.
I'll second it.
Seconded by Mr. Lyle. Let's have a vote, roll call vote on that.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
yes,
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Okay, so our second meeting in December is canceled. So after tonight, we'll see everybody back for the first meeting in January 2021. Hopefully it's a much better 2021 than 2020 has been for us. That being said, we'll now move to administrative reports. Mayor's office, Mayor Stoller.
Thanks, Mr. President, and good evening, council. I suppose I'll be the first of many reports that will also offer you all a Merry Christmas, since this may be the last time I see you before Santa arrives. I have 3 items to take care of tonight. Each one will take a little bit of time, so bear with me. The Planning Commission met at 5 p.m. this evening. 3 items on the agenda. They were all passed unanimously. The first one is a small parcel on West 47, about 1/4 of an acre for annexation. That had moved through the commissioners. Was now to Planning Commission. That's been approved. So you'll see that at some point through its normal process in the new year to continue that toward City Council. The other 2 items were both up for first reading tonight. So those met with full approval of the Planning Commission. And one is called Pine Knoll. The other is known as Fall Ridge. And what I want to tell you is the second item I'm going to talk about tonight, and I'll ask Chris in a moment to share a document with you that I put together for you this week to really bring you up to speed on housing. But I'll leave those 2 to Richard to report for rules. Chris, if you would, could you share that document? Look at that through the miracle of science. Now, if you look at the top third of that, I try to explain the flow. What you'll see is the last 12 years of how many homes we've built in Bellefontaine. You look just below that, you'll see that we average about 12 a year. If you look at the most, I'd say the most 3 recent, which is 2018, 19, and 20, you'll see that those numbers have steadily increased. And I remind City Council that it was late in 2017 that Council passed an ordinance which offered a CRA, or Community Reinvestment Act, which actually forgives the tax for a certain period of time. So really incentivize developers to begin to invest, and you see some of the differences that are being made. Now let me go through these next. I've got them titled as ongoing projects. So I want to show you. The other thing you see just above that word, you see that there are 8 building lots that were platted in the city. That's all that remained for an R1 house. Now that actually is a very recent number. It was the end of 2019. Now since that time, we've made some changes through council, through planning, and certainly through investment. So let me just run through these. The first one we call Willow's End, also known as Levan Woods. That's where condominiums have been built just off of Reservoir Drive, and that road is called Willow's End. There are 8 units completed, but that it can still grow by another 24, but 8 units just this year. The second one really is a success story. Eagle's Nest are condominiums that were built just off Malone Avenue, which is behind Taco Bell on the south end of town. Just in 2 years, Mark Broombaugh built 8 in the first year, 12 in the second year, and they're not only sold, but he has money going, he has room for 9 more, and that's what he's hoping to build in next year. And he's already got folks that are calling for those condominiums. So great news for those additions. Pine Knoll is off of White Pines Drive. So that's back in the Whispering Pines section. You'll remember we've shared several stories. This was the old Wong Bong Chaw property, and it had really fallen into disrepair. There was also some arguments between 2 neighbors that owned properties and right-of-ways. This has all been settled. It's beautiful. It's just a straight set of 8 homes that can be built along that section. So as you're driving toward 179 on White Pines, it's all of the homes or the lots that are vacant to the left. I'm pleased to announce that 6 of those 8 lots are already spoken for. So no pressure to pass this tonight, but this is going to be a nice development in Whispering Pines. And just to exemplify or to somehow display for you the need for quality developments, these things are going very well. On Malone Avenue, which gets you back to Eagle's Nest, we've approved 5 additional R1 houses. Now they could be condos, but they're going to look similar to his Mark Broombaugh's development. He also has additional land, but he thinks next year 9 remaining condos and 5 homes. Again, he built 12 this year. His goal is 14 next year, so we wish him luck. Now, Maris Park is really our biggest project that sits out in front of us. It's that land between County Road 10 that runs along 179 and is adjacent to Whispering Pines. We've already approved 22 building lots, but I want to remind you, just based on Tim Notstein's estimates on how you put it, maybe a home on a half an acre, there's a possibility of a total of 150 homes someday. Again, Jeremy Levan is developing that. He's just biting off what he can chew. But right now there's 22 lots. David, I got to ask you to jump in and help me. Do you remember, so many of them are spoken for. I want to say it's 4 or 6 or something like that, but he's already has some activity at Maris Park. You remember, David?
I believe it's 6, but I know there's at least one house already constructed there on the corner at the end of White Pine. So it's an ongoing project already.
Yeah, it's perfect. So that one's really going to be exciting. Keep in mind, before this list was developing, we had 8 lots that somebody could buy in our home to build a single family home on. So you can see the progress that we've made really together. Campbell Landing, that's exciting. Today we actually had news that the first of the 2 buildings may be occupied by late January. So we're really excited about that. And someday soon we'll be marketing or assisting where we can to offer a phone number or an email address so that folks in town who would like to live in the new apartments can make application. Pine Brook Estates. Now that's across the road on 179. Again, this is more of Mr. Chaw's property. You'll remember Mr. Chaw's deceased. Some of his kids actually live in North Korea. And so it's been a complicated process. But Rich Moldis, who's developing Pine Knoll, is also working on a plan to develop something like 13 homes across the street. You just have to stay tuned for that. He's only offered a preliminary plan. Those may change quite a bit before they come back to Planning Commission. So stay tuned. But just to keep these straight, in the playbook, that's Pine Brook Estates. And lastly, Fall Ridge Estates, that's also on your legislation tonight. That's when you drive through Shawnee Trace and several of those roads back there. You know that the city worked together with the owner, Jerry Robinson, to both contribute to that road going through. I hope some of you have driven that. It's really a nice piece that connects 2 ends of town. The 9 lots that were a preliminary plat has been approved and again sent on from Planning Commission to you tonight, is only for 9 homes, and it's just off that road. And Tim Notstein, if he were on this, would remind you, Jerry Robinson hasn't steered very far. That's how many lots it was always designed to hold. However, he's created a cul-de-sac in the middle of it, which is really kind of cool. And it allows some of the homes to sit up high on the hill and have a cool view of Bellefontaine. Anyhow, that's Pine Brook Estates. No, I'm sorry, that's Fall Ridge. So the 9 lots, that's what you're considering tonight. The remaining lots, as you drive through there and even see where the road comes out on Brown Avenue, there can be a future of condominiums on that left-hand side, that east side, Also, there can be homes up along Brown Street. So it's just really turned into a nice looking project. And I'm just teasing you with these last three. There's an offer to make the land purchase behind Ludlow Bridge. I can't tell you. In fact, Zeb, you lived in Ludlow Bridge. I can't tell you how many condos are there, but there was an equal amount of land behind that. And we have a gentleman working through the engineering office to extend more condominiums in that direction. Christina Drive, there's discussions about someone else possibly building apartments. And Wright Street is also part of that Broomball. He owns the land. Someday he'd like to build more condos there. However, I told you about his plans for next year, which are pretty hungry. I'll move on to my third item, but I can pause to see if anybody, if I've lost anybody on this. And Chris, leave that up for a second. Anybody have questions about the numbers? It was like putting a puzzle together this week, and I worked with Tim a lot, but I tried to get it all on one page just to show you where we've been and really what a difference it's made in the last 3 years that we've helped to incentivize builders who really go at risk when they build a house or they build apartments. We've helped with the tax abatement. So I want to thank you for that. Any questions?
Mrs. Baker?
None? Oh,
Yeah, I just, Mayor, is this something that you could share with us by an email or something like that?
absolutely. Yeah, this same document, but I wanted to explain it because if I just threw you this document, I was afraid it spoke to me and not to you. So I will explain it, and I will definitely tomorrow, I'll send that same document so that you have that for your records.
Okay,
Love to.
great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Any
Last
other
item.
questions for the mayor? Go ahead. Sorry, sir.
No, it's great.
want to make sure.
I'd love to hear any comments or questions. The last one, and I need to go to my notes here. There are a number of appointments that I make through the year, but this is a busy time of year. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 different commissions, most of whom are the same people. But I want to explain, and then I'll offer those notes up again for President of Council to get your kind of a voice vote on these. The first board is one we don't hear about. I'm not even sure they've ever met, but it's called the Board of Tax Review. And it was required when we took on RETA. We also had to create a tax review board. These are 3 finance people in our community, Tammy Gump, Rebecca Wilkins, and Colton Lowry. They've all served a 2-year term. I think all of them said, have we ever met? So, but their term expires at the end of December. They've all agreed to another 2-year term. So that's one commission. Second one is civil service. Joan Haushalter serves us very well. In fact, she's chairman of civil service. She's agreed to another 3-year term, and I think we're blessed there. So I would offer her name for civil service. On to the Parks Commission. You'll remember that Chris's Parks Board is made up of 7 members. 3 are appointed from the mayor. 3 are appointed from Bellefontaine City Schools. And then those 6 members create, they nominate their 7th member. Davey Roberts, he will expire at the end of December. He's serving us very well, and he's agreed for another 3-year term. So I would propose Davey Roberts. And lastly, Planning Commission. Now I want to tell you, this is really a celebration. Mark Barlow has served since 2001. He has served 20 years on Planning Commission. So if you see him, thank him. I certainly have. But I'm going to propose Tammy Gump. Tammy, of course, hospital experience, finance experience, and she's involved with a lot of our community. This is actually a 6-year term. Sounds like we're electing her judge or something. So I want to offer Tammy Gump, who has also agreed that she would be glad to serve. Planning Commission, sorry, that's a long list. President Zeb, I'm glad to go over that again if I went too fast, or answer any questions.
No, I got it all here. Is there any questions for the mayor on any of those nominees for any of those boards or commissions? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to go through here. We'll start with the Board of Tax Review. Can I have a motion and a second to appoint Tammy Gump, Rebecca Wilkins, and Colton Lowry, each to a 2-year term for the Board of Tax Review?
I'll make that motion.
Motion made by Mr. Kurtz. Looks like I got a second by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Okay. Now we'll move to the Civil Service Commission. May I have a motion and a second to appoint Joan Househalter to a 3-year term for the Civil Service Commission? Motion by Mrs. Baker, seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Next, can I have a motion and a second to appoint Davy Roberts to a 3-year term to the Park Commission? Motion made by Mr. Lyle, seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle, Mr. Lyle.
I think he's frozen. Let's come back to him.
Okay. Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
That motion does pass. If Mr. Lau comes back online, we'll seek his vote then, but we'll move on to Planning Commission now. Can I have a motion and a second to appoint Tammy Gump to a 6-year term for the Planning Commission? Moved by Mr. Springs, seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle.
Mr. Lau has exited the meeting.
Oh, okay. Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Wanted to thank you. That was certainly a bunch. I'll be sending out letters thanking them all for continued service. Nick, are you back? It looks like he's back.
I think he's frozen again.
He's frozen again. And certainly I'll send Mark Barlow another. I had a chance to visit with him after today's Planning Commission, but another congratulatory. That's quite a contribution to Planning Commission. And so I thank you again. Merry Christmas. I do want to I have to add this. You know, we can look back and say, wow, what a challenging year. But I tell you, I'm starting that arduous process of going through my notes for the whole year, starting to compile a year-end review. And we've really had a tremendous year. So thank you all for your contributions to another successful year in Bellefontaine. I know it's not over yet. It's not a Happy New Year, but I want to thank you while I have a chance. Thanks again, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Henry, Service Safety Director.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, Council. I don't really have a report per se, but I'll tag on to what the mayor just mentioned there. And I talked about this in my department head meeting just this last week. As we all know, 2020 has been a heck of a year, right? I mean, it's been challenging in so many ways that we could have never predicted when 2020 started. So I just wanted to, say that our city workers, including city council, have been hard at work every day during this time to make sure that our services and jobs that we do to provide for our community have continued uninterrupted. They've done everything in their power to do that. We've had to find new ways to do things, adapt new procedures, sometimes by the day, as Fred can attest to that. It seemed like these policies from the federal government rolled out and our local health district, sometimes daily, we were having to update our employees on new procedures that we had to do. But we've maintained, and in many instances, we've been able to improve some services, ways that people can pay their utility bills. A good example. I mean, we've come up with new ways to do that. So I just wanted to say, as the year ends, and this is potentially our last city council meeting, that I'm very proud of the team that we have here at the city. Not only our employees, but our members of administration and city council here. Hats off to us. I hate to pat ourselves on the back, but we've really overcome a lot of obstacles this year to make sure that we have some sense of normalcy at the municipal level. So I just want to thank everyone for what they've accomplished this year. I'd like to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, and maybe more than any other year, I look forward to 2021 and starting a new year, and hopefully it's one of our greatest years ever here in the city of Bellefontaine. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. Law Director, Mr. Stolle.
Thanks, Mr. President. Good evening, Council. Not much left to say after the mayor's great report and Mr. Henry's well-said words. So Merry Christmas to everybody. I would point out that we topped the 100 pieces of legislation mark this year. I think we've got 101 items on the agenda. I think that's the most I've seen in the last 5 years. So kudos to you for being efficient and on top of all of the ever-moving pieces of legislation. And Fred, in your office, thanks for staying on top of all of the CARES Act and COVID-related financial matters. And so I think the city's in as good a position as we can be given the time. So hats off to everybody. Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Mr. Stolle. Auditor's report, Mr. Brentlinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, Council. I think a lot's been said, and to piggyback on Mr. Stolle's there about the 101 pieces of legislation, I think over 10 of them dealt with the CARES Act and the coronavirus regulations, and hopefully the one that you address first tonight will be the last one this year or even next year. So it's been a stressful time in the auditor's office. Right in the middle of the coronavirus, we had our chief deputy resign, and we've replaced her with Tracy Burton. Tracy's doing an excellent job filling in and adjusting and, learning the ropes. So again, it's been an interesting year. I think everyone in the city has pulled through and carried their weight and exceedingly. So that's all I have to say, and wish everyone a Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brentlinger. I guess I'll throw it to Chris. Chris, do you have any report?
Yeah, just real quick, we're real close to wrapping up the project out at Myra. It is out of this world, so if you get a chance to go out and check it out, it's well worth it. It is not officially open to the public yet, but just standing on top of the hill looking at it, it's very impressive. So I wanted to share that. Wanted to say thank you all for the great support. I'll kind of speak on that behalf of the other department heads. A year like this is unlike any other. And I know we have all felt great support from council, from the administration. We're really proud of what our staffs have done to be responsible. We've had very few people have to be off because of this, because they've been responsible. And when people have been off, I've been really impressed with the way everybody's pulled together. So it's been a unique year, but I'm just really proud to be a part of this team, and you guys are a part of that as well. So thank you, and have very happy holidays.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. With that concludes our administrative reports. We'll now move to reports of standing committees. Finance Committee, Mrs. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we had discussed earlier, we're going to be moving our legislation to clear everything out here at the end of the year. Ordinance 2098 is the additional coronavirus relief distribution fund monies. This is phase 4. So as Mr. Brentlinger said, we're hoping this is it. We will be asking to waive the 3 reading rule and ask to pass that on first and final this evening. Ordinance 2099 is a new part-time deputy bailiff position for the municipal court. And this is an hourly position, $15 an hour. It does include fringe benefits, a maximum of 30 hours per week. And this is paid for out of the general fund. We'll be asking for first and final on that one. So we'll be asking to waive the 3 reading rule. And then for second reading this evening, ordinance 2088 is the kind of housekeeping ordinance that we have to do so that we can do business beginning January 1st. We had the exhibit of all those vendors that are included in this with our last agenda. We'll be asking for second and final and to waive the 3 reading rule on that one. 2089 is to advertise for bids and go into contract for the purchase of a new ambulance for Bellefontaine Fire Department. We'll be asking to waive the 3 reading rule and second and final on that one. 2090 is to establish the compensation package for the municipal court prosecutor, secretary, and paralegal and victims witness coordinator position. We'll be asking to waive the 3 reading rule, second and final on that one. And then up for adoption this evening, 2080 is the temporary appropriations for expenses for 2021. Remember, this doesn't include any capital expenditures at this time. So we'll be asking for adoption on that this evening. 2081 and several of the next ones here. Let's see, 2081, 82, and 83 are all compensation packages for the clerical workers, service workers, and the supervisory staff here at the city. So we'll be asking for adoption on that one. And then 2084 is the compensation for the mayor, council president, council members, clerk of council, law director, city treasurer, and city auditor for 2021. Remember, that does not make any change from 2020. It's the same. Be asking for adoption on that one. 2085 is the compensation for the municipal court judge. We'll be asking for adoption on that one this evening. And 2086 is to, let's see, go into contract for the wastewater treatment plant sludge thickener. We'll be asking for adoption on that one this evening. That ends my report. Merry Christmas to everybody. I don't see you before.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Rules Committee, Mr. Kurtz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules Committee has 3 ordinances on the agenda this evening. Ordinance 20-100 is to approve the Pine Knoll subdivision and dedication plat, and we'll be asking for first and final on that. Ordinance 20-101 is to approve the Fall Ridge subdivision, phase 1 and dedication plat, and we'll also be asking for first and final on that. And the third ordinance is 20-87. That's to change zoning classification for lots 2909 and 2910 and a 10th acre tract from R1, which is a 1-family residence district, to R3, which is a multi-family residence district. And that is up for adoption. That ends my report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kurtz. Safety Committee, Mr. Lau. You're on mute, sir.
Thank you. I have no report.
Okay, before you unmute, Mr. Lyle, I'm gonna come back to you on a couple of the motions that we had during the mayor's report that I think you froze up on. The first one was the appointment of Davey Roberts to the Parks Commission for a 3-year term. Do you wish to vote on that?
I do. I vote yes.
Okay. And the other one that you missed was the Planning Commission to appoint Tammy Gump to a 6-year term. Do you wish to vote on that?
I vote yes on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your report. Utilities Committee, Mr. Springs.
Yes, Mr. President, I just would like to report that last week we had the bid opening for the new refuge contract. We received one bid and it is currently being reviewed by the city law director. We have until, I believe, December 18th to notify them that we're going to accept it, and then that will begin in 2021 at the end of January. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Springs. Streets Committee, Mr. DeSoma.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report.
Thank you, Mr. DeSoma. Sidewalks, Curbs, and Parks Committee, Mr. Reeser.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Mr. President. At the Joint Recreational District meeting last week, they were talking about the winter sports that are getting underway. Wrestling is done registering, but basketball is still happening. So if people want to get registered for that, I think it's till January 15th. If I'm wrong, Chris, it might be worthwhile to chime in on that one. Patrick City Playground is almost done. And like Mr. Meyer said there, my year is looking great. I'm excited to go take a walk in it when it's all nice and open. But other than that, they've interviewed several candidates for the staff to replace Tracy Burton. And it looks like they're getting that list dwindled down a little bit. But that finishes my report. Merry Christmas, everybody, if I don't see you.
Thank you, Jordan. Audit Committee, Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report, but I wish you all a Merry Christmas also.
Thank you, Mrs. James. That concludes our reports of standing committees. We'll now move to the portion of our meeting where we welcome communications from citizens. As per the standing rule and order from the City Council, citizens who wish to communicate with council are to submit their communications in writing to the clerk at 6:00 p.m. the Sunday immediately preceding council meetings. No such communications were submitted. We encourage members of the public who wish to communicate with members of council or council in general to submit those writings to the clerk by 6 p.m. immediately preceding the council meeting. So with that, we'll close our communications from citizens portions of our meeting, and we'll now move to ordinances for first reading.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the county coronavirus relief distribution fund ordinance and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Baker.
Motion to pass on first and final.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing and creating a new deputy bailiff position for Bellefontaine Municipal Court and authorizing the municipal judge and clerk of court to take the necessary action for the hiring of said new deputy bailiff and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
Seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on first and final.
Seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance approving the Pine Knoll subdivision and dedication plat containing 1.771 acres, including 6 lots in Jefferson Township, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mr. Kurtz,
Move to waive the 3 reading rule.
I'll second
seconded by
that.
Mr. Okay, I got Mr. Lyle.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Move to pass on first reading.
seconded by Mr. Lyle.
Oh, and final.
First,
Sorry,
that's first and final.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Think so.
Mr. Kurtz,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance approving the Fall Ridge subdivision Phase 1 and dedication plat containing 5.821 acres, including 9 lots in Lake Township, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mr. Kurtz,
Move to waive the 3 reading rule.
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Move to pass on first and final.
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for first reading. We'll now move to ordinances for second reading.
An ordinance authorizing the purchase of miscellaneous supplies, equipment, and services for use in 2021 and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on second and final.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
No.
nope, we jumped ahead there.
I'm excited. I'm excited.
An ordinance authorizing the service safety director to advertise for bids and enter into contract with the successful bidder for the purchase of a new ambulance for use by the Bellefontaine Fire Department and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on second and final.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for the Bellefontaine Municipal Court Prosecutor, Secretary, Paralegal, and Victim Witness Coordinator, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on second and final.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for second reading. We'll now move to ordinances for third reading.
An ordinance making temporary appropriations for current expenses and other expenditures during the fiscal year beginning January 1st, 2021 and ending December 21st, 2021, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Lyle.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, 2021 clerical workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, 2021 service workers pay ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for certain hourly employees of the city of Bellefontaine and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio, 2021 supervisory wage ordinance.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation for the mayor, president of council, council members, clerk of council, law director, treasurer, and auditor, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance establishing and providing for compensation of the Bellefontaine Municipal Court Judge for 2021 and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to seek proposals and/or advertise for bids and enter into contract with the selected contractor and/or bidders for the City of Bellefontaine wastewater treatment plant sludge thickener project number 2020-06 and declaring an emergency in the City of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Lyle.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
An ordinance changing the zoning classification of lots 2909 and 2910 and a 0.10 acre tract from R1 one family resident district to R3 multifamily residence district, amending the zoning map and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mr. Kurtz,
Move to adopt.
seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
I'll abstain as one of the property owners.
That abstention is noted and accepted.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for third reading and consequently concludes our legislative agenda for the year, and not only for the night. We'll now move to communications from the clerk.
Just to wish you all a Merry Christmas.
Merry
That's it.
Christmas.
Thanks.
That being said, are there any communications from members of council?
Merry Christmas.
Well, I got a couple items here. Number one, we're coming up on a new year. I will be reshuffling the committee assignments as I typically do every year. So if there's any committees that you want to be on or you don't want to be on, shoot me an email, councilmanwagner@gmail.com. Let me know your thoughts and what your interests might be. And then I'll probably issue something here around just after the first of the year as to the new committee assignments. What a long and strange trip it's been here in 2020. It's not the year that we wanted in some respects, but it's the year that we got. And I want to thank everybody here at the meeting, administration included, and Bonnie, for everything and all the accommodations that everyone has made to try to make our city government work to the best of our ability in light of the situations that we're in. And I think that any successful enterprise, that's exactly what they do. They take what's been given to them and they make the best of it. And I appreciate all of you and the work that all of you have done, and kind of being able to work with new methods of technology and meeting and getting together, and kind of sometimes having to make a little bit of the extra effort to make sure our government works. And I know our citizens are better served because of it. So I thank everybody for that. With that, I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. I hope I get to see some of you at least on Facebook or through other meetings, but it's always good to hear and see everybody out and about. So with that, I'll entertain a motion and a second to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Seconded by Mrs. James. We're adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody.